Some early projections about the Buccaneers from Mike Clay of ESPN says the Bucs should be pretty good, but his record prediction does not. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this Friday episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every single day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at @JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media, covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And for that, I want to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message. It may be about the Bucs, it may be about music, it may be about hockey, maybe about the NBA playoffs, could be about anything. But you can become a Locked On Bucs insider at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs. Liam Coen versus Dave Canales. An interesting question from the live chat on Thursday's episode. That's coming up in a little bit. But first, let's start with ESPN's Mike Clay, who did a full league projection for stats and team records. Now, for those of you who don't know who Mike Clay is, you're unfamiliar with his work, he is a fantasy football analyst for ESPN, and way back in the day, I was actually on his Sirius XM fantasy football show because he and I got into a disagreement on Twitter. This was right after the Buccaneers had signed Deshaun Jackson. And so he and I were going back and forth on Twitter, and he DMs me. He says, you know what? Come on my show. Let's talk about it. It's so much easier than doing it on Twitter. I think it could be a really fun conversation. And so I went on his show. I defended my side. He defended his side. He ended up being 100% right. I was completely wrong, but Mike is a great dude. I always enjoy speaking with him whenever I have the opportunity to. He and I have run into each other a couple of times since then, but all of Clay's team projections came out, and he has some pretty solid stats lined up for the Buccaneers. And looking over those, I thought, man, he kind of likes the Bucs this season. So we're going to start with the offensive side of the ball. And mind you, this does have a fantasy football spin on it. So I'm going to drop a little bit of that information as we go through. But let's start things off with Baker Mayfield. He has Baker projected at 15 games played. Now, that is pretty much standard across the board. He doesn't really project any players to play a full 17 games, whether that's quarterbacks, wide receivers, running backs. Across the league, he pretty much has typically 14 to 15 games played for all of these guys. But he has Baker Mayfield with 3,899 yards, 24 touchdowns, 12 interceptions, along with 162 rushing yards and another rushing touchdown there, plus being sacked 40 times. Yikes. So a 2-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio, not quite as good as last season, but it's not terrible either. Also, fewer yards than last season in the passing game, but it's still close to that 4,000 yard mark. You project that out over 17 games, it would easily eclipse that 4,000 yard threshold. As for the running backs, he has Rachaad White with 870 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground, with another 395 receiving yards, 2 more touchdowns. So well over 1,000 all-purpose yards there for Rachaad. He actually has Bucky Irving as the second leading rusher on the team with 299 rushing yards and a pair of touchdowns. Then Chase Edmonds with 236 rushing yards and a score. He marked all 3 of those running backs with 14 games played. So again, you extrapolate Rachaad White's 870 yards as a per game average over 17 games played, you're probably closing in similar to last year to that 1,000-yard rushing mark. Receiving, and I know some of you are going to love this, Mike Evans, with 15 games played, leads the way with 77 receptions for 1,138 yards and 7 touchdowns. He makes sure that he's got Evans up over that 1,000 yards yet again. Evans actually comes in 1 yard shy of 10th among all receivers in receiving yards on these projections. Chris Godwin, just under 1,000 yards with 973 plus 5 touchdowns on a team-high 81 receptions. Trey Palmer, third, with 440 yards, 3 touchdowns. Then Jalen McMillan with 395 and 2. Then Devin Tompkins with 120 and a touchdown. Tight ends, Cade Otton, of course, is the leader there, 457 yards, 3 touchdowns. Then Payne Durham with 101 and 1. Keeft with 76 and a score. And then Devin Culp, just 19 receiving yards in his rookie campaign. From a fantasy spin, he has Baker as the 19th quarterback, Rashad as the running back 12, Evans is wide receiver 11, Godwin is wide receiver 28, and then Otton is tight end 23. All of those are projected for PPR leagues. For those of you that don't play fantasy football, PPR means you get 1 point for every reception. So that's how those guys stack up in points per reception leagues. Overall, I don't hate these numbers for any of the players outside of the sacks for Baker Mayfield. Yeah, his touchdowns are a little bit down. His interceptions are a little bit up, but it's nothing egregious. Now, Baker has been sacked 40 plus times in a season in 3 different years of his career. It was his second year in Cleveland in 2019. He was sacked 40 times. Then in 2021, he was sacked a career high 43 times. And then last year with the Buccaneers, he was sacked 40 times. So again, I don't think this is a blasphemous prediction by any means from Mike Clay, but I would tend to believe that with the improvements on the offensive line, or at least the attempted improvements on the offensive line, with the drafting of Graham Barton, and then we're going to see if Sua Opeta can outperform Matt Filer and Aaron Stinney from last year, which really shouldn't be too difficult to do. I would venture to think that the protection for Baker will be better, and that's going to bring those sack numbers down a little bit. And then really, if you think about it, Baker Mayfield escaped probably a dozen or more sacks last year on his own. So it's kind of scary to think about how high that sack number could have been for Baker and the Bucs last year. It probably would have gone well over that career high of 43. And then I also think that Rashad could be in line for that 1,000-yard rushing season. Again, you extrapolate the 870 over 14 games, you're getting pretty close. He was 10 yards away last year. And again, with the improvements along the offensive line, I do think that Rashad's in line to reach that 1,000 yards. The wild card to me is Bucky Irving, and whether or not he gets enough of a workload that cuts into Rashad's carries, it could hurt his chances. At the same time, Bucky being productive and cutting into Rashad's carries a little bit would actually be a good thing for the Buccaneers, because if he's getting that much of an opportunity, that means that he's playing well, and the Bucs made a really good pick on day 3 of the NFL draft. It's also worth noting that Mike Clay in these projections has the starting offensive line as Tristan Wirfs, Barton at left guard, Robert Hainsey at center, and then Cody Mauch and Luke Gedeke on the right side. So that's something that we know is possible if Opeta is struggling in training camp in the preseason, and the Bucs feel that they need to move Graham Barton over. But at this stage, I think it's pretty safe to say that Barton is going to be your starting center, and the rest of the chips are basically going to fall where they may. Rounding out the offense, Clay had his projected league rankings. He has the Bucs with the 21st total offense in the league, coming in at number 30 in rushing, which I guess is an improvement over last season. And then he has them in the top 10 in passing attempts, passing yards, passing touchdowns, and in sacks allowed. So that sack number, again, isn't great, but you take a look at a lot of the top 10 projected stats for the offense, And again, you say to yourself, those are some pretty solid numbers. That is some belief there in the Buccaneers and their offense. But what about defensively and that win-loss prediction? That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, or in my case, 2 different times, full sets of brakes and rotors for my car and my wife's car. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. It made shopping for those brakes and rotors, in my case, super easy and stress-free because I knew when they arrived, they were the exact right parts for my car. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listen review every single day. Every dayers, make sure you are coming back on Monday. I will be diving into the film on Tyke Smith as I've been going through my film series, bringing you about one of those episodes every week. But Tyke Smith is the next one on the list. I have plenty to say about him. In the meantime, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Then make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis as well as opinions and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Real quick, before we dive back into Mike Clay's projections, I want to give a shout out to all of you in the chat. I see David Stacks. I see Lakita Misner, Sieg, Stu, Noah. I see all of you in there. I appreciate each and every one of you jumping in and joining the show. But now back to ESPN's Mike Clay and his season projections for the Buccaneers. And I'm going to take a look at the defensive side of the ball. I'm not going to run through every player and every stat, but I wanted to take a look at some projections of some key stats. So let's start things off with sacks. Yaya Diaby, Mike Clay has him leading the team with 6.6 sacks. And before you say it in the chat, I know, as does Mike Clay, that you cannot actually finish the season with 6.6 sacks. But these are algorithmic per game predictions totaled out to a full season. So essentially, he's saying 6.5 sacks for Yaya Diaby. And then he has Vita Vea and Kalijah Kancey each with 4.5 sacks, tied for second. Rookie Chris Braswell with 4.1 sacks. And then Randy Gregory rounds out the top 5 with 3.7. Interceptions are, well, they're not pretty. He has Antoine Winfield Jr. at the top of the team with 3.3. Then Jordan Whitehead in second with 2.7. So 6 out of the team's projected 13 interceptions will come from the safety duo. Then both Jamel Dean and Zion McCollum with 1.6 interceptions apiece. Rounding out the top 5 is Levante David with 0.9, or essentially 1 interception for Levante. Clay has Levante as the team's leading tackler with 140. Then Antoine and Jordan Whitehead leading the way in snaps with 1,029 apiece. He has Tyke Smith. Speaking of Tyke Smith, who I'll be bringing you my film study on, he has him listed as a safety, taking 87 snaps. That is well below Christian Izien and Tavier Thomas. Christian Izien has 433 projected snaps. Thomas with 596. So it looks like Mike Clay views Tavierre Thomas and Christian Izien as kind of that slot corner duo, with Tavierre Thomas getting the bulk of the snaps between the two players there. From a fantasy spin, he has Antoine Winfield Jr. as the number 1 overall safety, Jordan Whitehead, the 31st safety, Levante as the 6th overall linebacker, which I absolutely love. Then Vita Vea and Kalijah Cansey as the 25th and 27th overall defensive lineman. Jamel Dean as the 17th overall corner. And then Yaya Diaby as the top-ranked Buccaneers edge rusher, coming in 40th overall. Again, I don't hate these numbers, but I don't really love a lot of these either, not the way that I did with the offensive side of the ball. If the Buccaneers are going to succeed, those 41 projected total team sacks have to be much higher in reality than they are on Mike Clay's projections. And then Dean and McCollum both have to do a heck of a lot better than combining for 3 interceptions. I mean, you take a look at these projections, those two, your top 2 starting outside corners, are projected to get fewer combined interceptions than Antoine Winfield Jr. And we know Antoine is him, but those corners have to do a much better job of taking the ball away and being opportunistic if this defense is going to find success. I certainly think that Vita Vea is going to be much better than the 25th overall defensive lineman as long as he's healthy, but I also like seeing Cansey in the top 30 in just his second season in the NFL. But that edge rush has to be a bigger factor than what Clay has projected here. Ultimately, overall, I don't have a huge issue with any of the numbers that Mike Clay has presented here for the Buccaneers, or at least I didn't until I got to the win-loss projections. Clay has the Bucs slated for 7.6 wins, or essentially 7-10 or 8-9. And here's where it gets just slightly insulting. He has the Bucs going into the bye week at 2-8. with the only wins coming against the Commanders and the Broncos. Then he has wins against the New York Giants, the Las Vegas Raiders, and the Carolina Panthers in Week 17 at home. He has the first Panthers game where the Bucs are projected 0.1 points fewer than Carolina, and then the final home game against the Saints is the same way, 0.1 points less than the Saints. Those, as I understand them with Clay and his projections every single year, are essentially pick'em games. So he isn't actually predicting the Buccaneers to lose to Carolina in Carolina or the New Orleans Saints in the final week of the season at home. He's just not predicting them to win either. So he has an overall season win probability of 45%, which equates to the 7.6 projected wins. That's where that number comes from. So when he takes a look at the matchup and the players and the analytics and all of that, he has win probabilities up and down the line week by week. Overall on the season, he has the Bucs at a 45% win probability. You divide 17 games by 45%, you get 7.65, which is where that win prediction is coming from. And again, a lot of this is based on his stat projections plus an analytical formula that gets used to calculate the win probability. So I'm not going to harp on it too much, but I wanted to mention it given some of the stats that he laid out. It seemed like, especially taking a look at the offensive side of the ball, he would have been in the 8.5 to 9.5 range rather than down to 7.5 or 7.6. All in all, this was actually one of the more respectful projections that I've seen for the Buccaneers. Evans just outside the top 10 in receivers, literally by 1 yard. He's outside of the top 10. Levante just barely outside of the top 5 in linebackers. Rashad as the 12th overall running back. Antoine is the number 1 overall safety. Jamel Dean, a top 20 corner. I don't hate this at all. Let's just hope that the win totals are the biggest thing that he underestimated for this team. In fact, I'm going to give a shout out to Mad Dog, longtime everydayer. He and I were chatting on Friday morning, texting back and forth, and he was sending some of these predictions. I think there was one from Pro Football Network that Levante was not in the top 10 in linebackers. There was another one where Mike Evans was not in the top 10 in wide receivers. There was one from NFL on CBS where they predicted the playoffs already. They had the Bucs in the playoffs, losing in the wild card round, but at least they had them there, I guess. So, and again, I love Mike Clay. He's really, truly a great dude. He puts in so much work on these projections, and a lot of these numbers are great. Let's just hope that win total is just a smidge off in what he is predicting there. I'm going to jump into the chat real quick. Destined for Greatness says, made it to the live show. Welcome in, Destined. Happy to have you here. Gary in the chat says, Winfield says he's guaranteeing a Super Bowl. I don't remember seeing that quote. I know he said that that's the goal, and he's trying to speak it into existence. I don't remember him ever guaranteeing one, but hey, he spoke being the best safety in the league and being the top 8 safety in the league into existence. Let's hope that rubs off on a Super Bowl, a Super Bowl championship for the Bucs. Jacko says, who cares what Mike thinks? Go Bucs. No, I think Mike does a great job. And again, the numbers, you take a look at Baker, you take a look at Mike Evans, and again, those guys were not projected full 17 game seasons. You extrapolate that out, you have numbers pretty similar to what Baker put up last year. He'll have over 40 or over 4,000 yards. He'll be closing in on 30 touchdowns. The interception numbers are a little bit high, but you're going to have Mike up over 1,200 yards receiving, probably close to around 10 touchdowns. But, I felt it was worth talking about because, again, I know Mike puts in a lot of work into these projections. And, again, some of the more, respectful numbers for the Buccaneers when it comes to some of the national media and doing their predictions. But Liam Coen or Dave Canales, an interesting question that was brought up during yesterday's live show. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. As you get older, you inevitably begin thinking about your future, and diving into the world of investing can be a daunting task, especially when you've never done it before. That's why I rely on Yahoo Finance to help guide me as I enter a whole different world, and I'm constantly looking for tips and information that help me get the wheels in motion. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. Whether you're a seasoned investor or you're like me and looking for that extra guidance, Yahoo Finance gives you all the tools and data that you need all in one place. They are the number one finance destination, producing a holistic look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and more. With a community of over 90 million users every month, their real strength is helping you on your way to financial success. So get into the game with the confidence that anything you need, Yahoo Finance can help you with. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com, the number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. Wrapping things up here on a Friday edition of the Locked On Bucs podcast, and I'm going to get to the chat again coming up in just a little bit. But during yesterday's live chat, Richard asked me, are you more of a believer in Liam Coen than you were Dave Canales at this point last year? And Richard, I don't see Richard in the chat right now, but I didn't see that question until we had already ended the show. And I thought, man, that is an absolutely phenomenal question. So let's talk about it. I would say at this point last year, I was excited about Dave Canales in the potential that I felt that he had. He came from an incredible organization with one heck of a mentor in Pete Carroll, who, Carroll brought him from USC. He worked hard to work his way up the ladder. And I thought the job that he did with Geno Smith in 2022 was outstanding. So I was really excited about what he could be. That was the big thing with Dave Canales, right? Was he was largely an unknown, never been an offensive coordinator. He hadn't called plays since he was coaching a high school team. So you didn't really know what you were going to get with him. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Every offensive coordinator had to get their start somewhere. They had to be a first-time offensive coordinator and a first-time play caller at some point. So someone young and fresh can bring new ideas to the table, get the best out of a lot of players by not recycling a bunch of old philosophies. And then when we got into the season, we would see flashes of really creative and successful play calling and play design. But there was that infuriating level of stubbornness, especially in the run game. There was a severe lack of usage in Chris Godwin, which didn't really get changed until his wife Mariah said something about it on Instagram. There was a steep learning curve that I think a lot of people thought that Canales had sort of beaten early on in the year when things were going so well, but then things went south for about 2 months. When it comes to Liam Coen, I'm more of a believer in him than I was Canales, largely in part because of Cohen's track record. He's been an offensive coordinator in the NFL, and it was with an insanely successful offense. Yes, Sean McVay was the play caller, but those two worked hand in hand to get that offense to the level that it was, which was one of the most electric in the league. Then Cohen goes to Kentucky, basketball obsessed, basketball country Kentucky, to be their offensive coordinator in the SEC, where there's powerhouses like Alabama and Florida and LSU and Auburn and Georgia and Tennessee. And he had one of the most impressive offenses in the conference. And he's doing it with these lower star recruits because the 4 and 5 star guys were going to the bigger programs, along with the Ohio States and the Michigans and the USCs and the Texases of the world. He does what works. And if it doesn't, he abandons it. And one of the things that I really, really like about Cohen's style, and I'm really excited to see him implement in Tampa, we talked about it on Wednesday when Evan Klosky was on the show. It's his propensity to put the power in the hands of the players. He's going to call 3 or 4 plays in the huddle and then let the players figure out what's going to work best against the defense that they're facing. They're the ones on the field. They're the ones going up against this defense and these other players. Yes, Cohen is working against the mind of the opposing defensive coordinator, but the players are the ones going against the players. So what do they feel is going to give them the best chance to succeed against those defenders that they're the ones out there having to go one-on-one with? I like Dave, and I think he could have been a really solid offensive coordinator had he gotten more time. But you cannot turn down a head coaching job when you get the chance. I personally don't think he was ready for it, and I think the situation in Carolina might put him on the Raheem Morris track where he's going to get fired and then probably have to become a position coach while having to work his way back up to coordinator before maybe getting another crack at being a head coach. But if I'm measuring my belief in Canales succeeding at this time last year versus my belief in Cohen succeeding at this moment in time right now, I have a much higher belief in Cohen than I did in Dave. I was just more excited about the potential of Dave than I was in the belief that he would be a huge success right out of the gate. And honestly, do not be surprised if the Buccaneers made this move with Cohen with the future in mind. I'm not sitting here saying that Bowles is going to get fired or anything like that. But if Todd Bowles decides sooner than later that he's ready to move on from the game of football and he decides to walk away from being a coach, Cohen is the type of candidate with the type of experience that could be a legitimate head coach in the NFL and potentially a seamless transition to the next era of Buccaneers football. So, Richard, I hope that answers your question. Going to jump into the chat real quick before we get out of here. I know I've tried to squeeze a lot into this episode. I just saw somebody in here. Let's see. Goodness. We have LeDevin Green says, yes, the OC is better. To be fair, we don't know if the OC is better. We believe that he will be because he has had success at other stops in the past, but we don't know for sure until we start to see it play out on the field with this team and this roster. Noah 2023 in the chat says, I still think 10-7 is reasonable. It absolutely 100% is reasonable. I think that's kind of the sweet spot. I think their ceiling, I mentioned it on yesterday's episode, I think their ceiling is 12-5. I think their floor is probably 8-9, but I see this team as a 9-10 win football team in the upcoming season. It really depends on if they can withstand that really tough stretch at the beginning and then take advantage of that real nice, what looks to be a favorable stretch coming out of the bye. That's really going to determine the Buccaneer season in a nutshell. Stu J in the chat. I just texted Stu J right before we went live. If that pressure goes up, those turnover predictions might look silly. That's a great point. That is absolutely a great point. And on the flip side, that 40 sacks that he has projected for Baker Mayfield could be a big reason that he has more interceptions projected for this season than Baker threw last year, because that's saying even with the changes along the offensive line, he's still expecting the pressure on Baker to go up. Hopefully we see the Bucs getting more pressure on the opposing quarterback this upcoming season. Noah in the chat says, I just don't know if that will win the division. I think 10-7 wins the division. I don't know if 9-8 is going to get the job done this year the way that it did last year. So, I mean, you take a look at the last 2 years in the NFC South, the Bucs got it done at 8-9. Then last year it took 9-8 to secure it. I think we're looking at another 1-game increase here, and 10-7 is going to be the mark that a team has to hit in order to have a shot at winning the NFC South. Last one real quick because I am out of time. Mark says, Canales started slowly, always predictable last season. Have to see how Cohen mixes his plays for comparison. Again, another great point. We do have to see, and again, he's going to put a lot of that power into the players. He's going to call 3 plays. Then it's going to be up to them to decide what play to run. So there may be some questionable play calls or some questionable plays we see from the offense that we may not be able to put on Liam Cohen. It may go on Baker Mayfield for switching into that call or deciding at the line that was going to be the play that they were going to go with based on what they were seeing from the defense. But like Evan said on Wednesday, Baker's pre-snap reads are always really, really good. Well, I shouldn't say always. That always means 100%. They are generally very, very good. He has a very, very good understanding of what he's seeing, incredibly high football IQ. So I could see him putting them in the best position for a play to succeed far more often than not. But Mark, you're 100% right. We're going to have to see how this starts to look, those first couple weeks of the season. With that, I am going to bid you all a fair adieu. Thank you all so much for spending some of your afternoon with me here on a Locked On Bucs Lunchtime Live. Please check out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. Make sure you're following on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs. Make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube with those notifications turned on so you know every time I'm going live. Or if you can't really get the live or you don't want to spend a half hour sitting down and watching the show, listen to me in the car. Listen to me in your earbuds on your favorite podcast platform of choice, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Podbean, any of those. We are on all of them. And become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding holiday weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.